Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Sunday, September 8th, 2024. I'm News 6 meteorologist David Nazario back with another tropical update here on the Weather Center. Thank you very much for those of you who are capable of tuning in this morning. I know yesterday may have been the more optimal time frame to do a live tropical update, especially with everything that was evolving through the tropical weather sphere throughout the day yesterday. When we started the day, we had Invest 91L that was designated out there in the Bay of Campeche, and then later on into the evening time, we had Invest 92L designated in the central periphery or the central areas of the main development region of the Atlantic Basin. So thank you all very much for joining me this morning. We're going to quickly go through a number of different variables. I have a lot of tabs open up towards the top. So for those of you tuning in, just want to let you know if you are brand new to the channel, please consider clicking subscribe. I don't roll out as routine of updates at this point anymore because I'm full-time with WKMG News 6 here in Central Florida, and that's where you'll find a lot of my now ongoing content on a day-to-day basis, every other day basis. But whenever I have some free time, as you can see here, first thing Sunday morning, we're here giving you guys the updates that you need to get you aware on what's happening out there during the peak of the hurricane season, which is going to be officially met in 2 more days, September 10th. So this upcoming Tuesday will be technically, per the calendar, the peak of the hurricane season, and we're kind of starting to see that put together here. We have 3 areas of interest. We no longer have just a bunch of yellow blips all across the spectrum. We have our red zone indicated here in the western Gulf of Mexico. This is AL91. This is Invest 91L that has plopped its way off the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and is now readily apparent in the Bay of Campeche, expected to lift up towards the north. We got an 80-90 split here, 48 hours chances of development, 80%, and then over the next 7 days, 90%. This is probably going to continue to go up. And one of the key takeaways here, regardless of all the jargon and the terminology and the verbiage they have written here, I want to pay close attention to the last sentence in this statement here. An Air Force Reserve Hurricane Hunter aircraft is also scheduled to investigate the system later today. This is what's going to be pivotal in giving us all the model and the analysis data that we need to further track this system. Because once again, I'm unfortunately seeing a lot of misinformation flying around out there. So if you guys wouldn't mind, for those of you joining in not only live during the chat itself, but even after the fact, if you're watching after the conclusion of this live stream, please consider nudging that like button. Let's get this information out there because there's still a lot of speculation going on. And at this point in time, we have an Invest designated. We have an area of low pressure, albeit very broad and very slow to rotate low pressure and mid-level low pressure. But it does seem like this one is going to do it for us. This will likely produce Tropical Storm Francine. And before we get into any of the finite details and what the data I've been ingesting and digesting looks like, that is probably where I would put it. I don't really foresee this becoming a hurricane, let alone a strong hurricane. We just are not in the typical environment with which we would produce a well-organized and bona fide tropical cyclone to the extent of a hurricane, but I can definitely see a mid-end tropical storm coming from this, especially once you take into the equation that we have a bit of supplementation going on in the uppermost portions of the atmosphere, helping to protect the system. I'll walk you guys through that here momentarily. And we have the natural geographic curvature of the Bay of Campeche here that will naturally allow the general physics of this system to try to smush itself together into that consolidated cyclonic spin that we see with our more recognizable tropical cyclones. So that's number one, numero uno, primarily going to be a flood, inland and coastal flood threat. I think that's going to be the kicker with 91L potential future Francine. As we wander out over the Atlantic, this is going to be the central tropical Atlantic. We have AL92. We've seen our formation chances bumping up. Over the next 48 hours, we're looking at a 40% chance of development. Over the next 7 days, a 60% chance of development. And this is likely also going to reach the red zone in the next couple of days. I do anticipate we're going to increase our formation chances a little bit as these 2 sacrificial features that are going to be pulling away from our monsoonal trough configuration out there in the Atlantic will perhaps get things a bit more favorable for the rest of the MDR to start to produce more tropical cyclones, or I should at least say more, I guess, robust and more well put together tropical waves. And then we have our other area of disturbed weather in O for 50 shot. No development expected over the next 2 days. However, a 50-50 chance we see something within the next week. This is something that's expected to roll off of Africa and move off towards the general west-northwest track that we see out there in the main development region of the Atlantic. And it will also begin to lift up towards the north. So that being said, here is our goes east. I love to paint the picture with this, and we're going to start off with one feature that just stands out the most to me outside of our tropical features, and that's this bad boy right there. So this is particularly why I'm curious to see whether or not we actually get very gratuitous development and organization with this system. There's another area that I want to highlight. We can start to talk about it a little bit on this. I was more or less kind of spoiling it as well, using my cursor just now to kind of draw that clockwise spin in there. But this channel darkening here in the water vapor, and this is our upper level water vapor, so we can look particularly at the jet stream. And this channel darkening right in through here, you can see we have the white shades, the green shades, and even the somewhat lighter blue shades on either north or south side of that feature there, that jet finger here. That indicates the presence of our polar front jet. The polar front jet dipping down in from Canada, and then we have our subtropical jet screaming in out of the East Pacific across the desert southwest, northern Mexico, and through Texas. This is part of the reason why I'm wondering, will we see something really big form up? Have systems in the past done that? Absolutely. We've seen rapidly intensifying systems out of the Gulf, Michael being a phenomenal example, and a very similar setup, obviously not attached to a stationary front, but down in the Western Caribbean brought on by the gyre, just like Idalia did last year. And I'm not talking dynamics at that point, I'm talking the source region. So when we have systems developing close to home, as the title of this video implies, we don't typically see a very rapid amount of organization, consolidation, and then intensification. Obviously, those are three very different things. Organization being the thunderstorms begin to come together. Consolidation being they finally squish themselves into a very tightly packed area of thunderstorm activity. And from there, we get that low pressure center to finally deepen down and begin to take on those more routine tropical characteristics. So this jet here would also tell me down at the surface, we probably have a temperature gradient, a difference between our mid-latitude and our subtropical air alongside the tropical air that's being pulled up from the south right out of the equatorial regions of Central America, the East Pac, and the tropics. So that's why I'm wondering if whether or not this will be a big feature or not, because again, going back to all the speculation I'm seeing, I've been seeing major hurricane, I've been seeing hurricane, and before you guys start coming for me in the chat, I don't know why. For some reason, there's a lot of other things going on out there in the weather sphere, and it's only this channel that seems to be poked and prodded. Not too sure why, but regardless, that's neither here nor there. The reason I'm mentioning whether this will be a big system or not before we get into the threats is because I don't want you guys hearing from one source, major hurricane, category 3. I already had someone ask me, is this going to be a Harvey? No, this is not going to be a Harvey. Very, very different setup, very, very different time frame, very, very different environmental dynamics. And we don't have a similar pattern to that of even which with Beryl came through, and we saw it moving into the east coast of Texas. So very different storms. We cannot draw the comparisons, and I refuse to draw comparisons, especially when it comes to something as disastrous as Harvey. That is not even on the table, ladies and gentlemen, so we do not have to be concerned about that. However, once we get into the threats, I will definitely say the rainfall is going to be an issue. Period. And as someone already mentioned in the chat, it does not need to be big to cause problems. Well, in this case, it definitely doesn't need to be anything pretty much to cause problems for our folks out there in the greater Houston area who are still likely recovering from Hurricane Beryl having made landfall a little over a month and a half, almost 2 months now ago in that general area. Then we have a Tut, once again, back in business, present, a little bit of wave breaking that's occurring over Bermuda through the Bahamas and down into the Central and Western Caribbean, which is why if you look, our tropical feature here that was once highlighted as a very low-end threat for tropical development or a low-end chance for development has been completely ripped apart. It's now shredded off towards the north, and we're seeing just remnant shower and storm activity affecting the Lesser Antilles, parts of the U.S., British Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. That's going to be the full extent of the situation here. Not expecting anything to come with that. There were a couple of model runs that tried to redevelop it as it got out of that area of Tut-induced wind shear, this tropical upper tropospheric trough, and that has no longer become an issue. There's no confidence that that thing is going to form up into anything, and in fact, you can see that the dry air and convection is completely suppressed anything and all of activity with it. And then finally, further upstream, this is going to be 92 right there. That is AL 92, which also has a decent shot at developing. It is far enough to the west, or the east, I'm sorry about that, to the east of our positive vorticity streamer to where it's not going to get hit by a lot of the shear that's destroying our first AOI that was highlighted sometime last week. This is likely going to start to pull away from the monsoon trough. The monsoonal trough is still down there. It hasn't moved anywhere, and that's why it seems like our features in the MDR are really not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere, and that's because it's entrained in that area of convergent wind flow associated with the extension of our monsoonal trough off of Africa. You can't really see it, but Africa is smothered by thunderstorms, rainfall, and shower activity, and that's very anomalous. That has probably been the most anomalous characteristic of this hurricane season, is the fact that we've had such strong rising velocities, a lot of precipitable water, and general moisture and humidity over Africa. That has been the problem with this hurricane season. Regardless of all the other Atlantic Basin features, that I think has been the most distinct characteristic of the hurricane season, is the fact that we are now experiencing what some will characterize as a 1,000-year flood, a 1,000-year event over Africa, and that in of itself is going to cause some derailing across much of the Atlantic. So right now, this is going to be our number one feature to discuss. This next area of incident or interest is likely going to start, I should say investigation, is likely going to try to consolidate a little bit. We have decent thunderstorm activity with it. We do not have any signs of a push of dry air. That's another thing I've been monitoring case by case, which is why I'm a little bit more confident in this feature developing. Some folks will still say no. Some folks will still say it's not going to happen. The 6Z, the 18Z, not consistent. Well, we got to look real time as well. We're not talking only models here. Right now, what I can tell you here, looking even at the satellite imagery, we do not have another setup for a wave to break over our anticyclone and drop down into the MDR and produce more of that continental mid-latitude dry air that'll essentially obliterate all of our systems down there in the MDR. That's been another consistent issue, and I can show you guys at a later date and time, but for the sake of not derailing this live stream, I'm not going to show you that. But for all intents and purposes, this area has a bit better of a shot at finally consolidating and lifting towards the north, because if you look at our overall pattern, the next time our long wave pattern should break or crest and crash should be as this mid-latitude mature wave here over northeastern United States and eastern Canada is going to make its way over the apex of our ridge, and that is what could introduce another push of that dry, stable air that would squash a lot of the stuff out there. So because we don't have that upstream occurring, you can see that just off the coast of Portugal, Spain, on the upper periphery of this chart. I know the globe here, the spherical nature of the satellite imagery doesn't really show you that. These are your Azores Islands. We don't see anything in the immediate vicinity that's going to dump southward and destroy what's going on down there. So seems like we might have a decent shot here, and I'm fully on board with the National Hurricane Center giving it that. I believe it was 60% shot right now. Yeah, 60% chance, right on board. I think that is definitely justifiable. Here's a look at our latest 6Z track guidance in pretty decent agreement. Obviously, we're still seeing that left to right jog. I'll walk you through the steering pattern. This is pretty set in stone. I know some folks are still mentioning that this could be more of a Texas threat. I've even seen some folks speculating. I'm not sure why. This is the same thing that happened with Lee this exact same time last year. I don't know why, but there's even folks mentioning that Florida could be a threat zone. Not the case. In fact, this close in time, if you look at the timestamps here, within the next 48 hours, we should have, if it's going to develop, I'm going to say that again, because I've noticed that for some reason this channel is under like what you'd see for political stations. Oh, he said this. I will repeat myself. In the next 48 hours, we should see, if this were to organize further, we should have our next named storm on the board as early as 48 hours from now. So as we roll into Monday night, Tuesday morning, this could be either PTC, potential tropical cyclone, tropical depression, or tropical storm Francine, if this were to continue to show such healthy signs of consolidation. We're not in full optimal alignment from the low, mid, upper levels of the atmosphere. We have that vortmax, that closed area of dry, low pressure coming in down from the north. And we also have lots of good overnight convection during our diurnal maximum. We're going to go into a diurnal minimum. The sun is coming up, so we're probably going to see some of that thunderstorm activity dissipate and wash itself out over Mexico. But I do see that in the next 48 hours, if it were to try to consolidate, our named storm should be there, and confidence is fairly high at this point. Our skill level is going to be fairly high because this is 72 hours, this is 96 hours. So because this is a close-to-home feature, we don't really have a lot of time to get ahead of it, and that's why we need to emphasize the threats, and we need to be very careful with how we characterize this. This is not likely to be a major situation, a major system. This is not going to rapidly intensify and bomb out over the next 48 hours. What I'm watching very closely is the interaction with the dry air and the temperature gradient that's still lingering over the southern Gulf of Mexico coastline, or I should say the southern Gulf coast states, as well as the dry air, the jet that's going to enhance our upper level shear around this system and the land interaction off to its west here. So sloppy tropical storm at best, mid-grade tropical storm. The flood threat, your storm surge, and your coastal flooding is going to be the biggest issue. Here's 92L watching for our Leeward Island friends out there in the Lesser Antilles. This could be another very close call if this were to get its act together. Same thing with the U.S. British Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. We're going to keep an eye on this. We have a lot more time with this feature ahead of us than we do for the example of 91L. 92L, we're not looking at anything getting close to our island friends down there, at least over the next 5 days. So a large difference. 5 days is when something may be creeping up your doorstep, whereas over in the Gulf of Mexico, we have 4 days until this thing has moved inland. And we do need to care about intensity. I'm also seeing that as well. That's another thing that I'm slowly but surely starting to develop my gripes about, because folks are canceling the hurricane season. Folks are still making fun of the hurricane season because all we can afford is a Bay of Campeche slop system. That's very unfair. That's extremely unfair. And some will come after me and say that I'm, quote, fear-mongering or hyping up nasty-looking systems. It's not what I'm doing. And for those of you who have followed this channel and who will continue to follow this channel as I get further and further into the weeds with Channel 6, I personally feel like every single system deserves their respect. We need to respect it. They all come in very different shapes and sizes. So intensity is going to play a role, because if it's not a very intense system, we're only going to get so much out of its impacts. There's a reason we look at systems and forecast their intensity, their track, because it's only exponentially going to increase what kind of impacts. Impacts matter alongside intensity, and I will fight tooth and nail for that. I respect the opinion, but intensity goes hand in hand with impacts. Let's put it to you this way. Let's use something totally unrelated to weather. If I'm someone brand spanking new to the gym and I get in, do a workout that Arnold Schwarzenegger would do in his prime during his Mr. Olympia age, obviously my intensity is not going to be there. I'm brand new to the gym. I can't put forth the level of intensity that Arnold Schwarzenegger could put forth in his Mr. Olympia days in a high-volume, high-intensity workout. There's that word again, high intensity. So obviously the impact on your body, the results you achieve from a lackluster intensity workout are going to be a lot less than, for example, if you go in and you're a very conditioned, very, very high-quality athletic individual, you're going to have that natural higher intensity, so you're going to have a much greater impact on the results you achieve. Does that make sense? Totally unrelated to weather, but the more intense a storm is, the more impact it's going to have on your local area. And let's put it from the rain perspective, as a matter of fact. A disorganized, sloppy mess, probably going to have a lot more impediments brought on by the dry air to the north, that temperature gradient. For those of you who are not familiar with that, I've always mentioned tropical cyclones do not like temperature gradients. They do not like frontal systems. They're very detrimental to it. Somebody actually asked me that phenomenal question on the chat. Let me go ahead and shout them, not in the chat, excuse me. Username Yorkie not found on Instagram. They actually asked that question. Do bigger systems or smaller systems usually feel the impacts of dry air, wind shear a little bit more? And I would argue the more broad, less intense systems will typically feel the impacts and the detriments brought on by dry air, wind shear, vorticity, temperature gradients a lot more than your more consolidated, stronger systems. So that's why we do have to monitor intensity. In this case, it's so close that I can understand the argument to where intensity is really not going to make much of a difference, but at the same time, it's very fruitful to watch what happens with its intensification over the next 4 days, because that could pay dividends for our folks out there in Louisiana. I have a number of people who tune in from Louisiana all the time. Same thing with our individuals recovering in the Houston area, the eastern Texas area from Beryl. If we have just a chain reaction of rainstorms, flooding is going to be a problem, but at the same time, we don't have to worry about storm surge, piling up of water, excessive amounts of tornadic activity as well. So Anyways, that's a whole other rant for another point in time. Let's continue back with the live stream. So we're watching 92L. 92L could possibly try to consolidate as it gets closer to the 4 to 5 day mark. And that's once again when we're going to continue to monitor for the Leeward Islands, the U.S. British Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. If this does try to consolidate a little bit faster, I do anticipate fully, given the pattern we have in place, that it will lift to the north and you guys will remain on the weak side of the system, if not feeling no impacts whatsoever outside of some good surfing conditions for the Leeward Islands. Now, we're going to get into a bit of the real-time dynamics affiliated with this system. So there's a couple things on this water vapor shot that we're looking at here, and this is brought to us by the College of DuPage. We're not looking at tropical tidbits, cyclonic weather, etc. And the reason we have this AOY, this map pulled up, is we're going to start to talk about the smaller scale features. On that goes east full disk, we talked jet stream, macro scale, the big picture. Now we're going to hone in on a few things that are not related to models. So first and foremost, this is our invest. And on the tab just to the immediate right of this, or the next one coming up, we have our true color visible satellite shot, which is, I think, fantastic because it gives us that little bit of a zoomed perspective so we can see the mesoscale, the synoptic scale perspective of what we're looking down on, but it also flows so visually high definition. How do I describe it? It's a very high definition to the naked eye model. That's what visible satellite is. It's to the naked eye what we can physically see, and the satellite is looking through it like it has eyeballs. But anyways, I'll show you what else we have going on the true color in a second. But first and foremost, this is something that meteorologist Jonathan Kagas and I talked about on Friday night when him and I did our collaboration on the Just Weather page. There is already pretty solid cyclonic or anticyclonic flow over this system, and if you look, that's precisely why we're seeing such a flare-up of moisture and thunderstorms. They're still pop-up in nature. They're still very pulse-like. They're not the most organized. We did have a nice little MCS, almost MCC-type feature fire during the diurnal maximum overnight, but a lot of that rainfall is now moving into Mexico, possibly creating issues for them down in that general area, of course. But this could help to shroud us from a lot of the issues that we may face with the dry air and that temperature gradient or lingering jet stream to the north here. I'll use a different color so we can illustrate this a little bit better. So here's the jet. That's not the color I wanted. I definitely clicked yellow. Thank you very much. I'm going to increase the size of my pen here because we're going to leave this static on the chart. So here is our jet stream right there. And the reason I have the jet stream on here is because the jet obviously is going to induce wind shear. Now, the thing with that is, further towards the north, we're going to feel the effects of the wind shear. But where this system is right now, which is again why I do believe we're seeing great amounts of thunderstorm activity firing up, what the jet is doing as those winds round the apex of a very broad subtropical high height center here is it's allowing the interaction of the jet to increase the level of intensity and upward vertical velocity that we see brought on by the anticyclone over top our feature. Obviously, down and at the surface level, and I'll shrink the pen again, we have our low and mid-level broad cyclonic feature there. So if you notice, our moisture is very well stuck in this anticyclonic pocket. And closest to the center, I think this is a wonderful visual representation as well. You can see closest to the center where we would naturally assume our rising velocities associated with the diffluence aloft is most concentrated, just so happens to be right under our tropical cyclone. And we have streamlines pulled up as well so we can better illustrate this here in a second. So we would have to take full advantage of this area of favorable setup before moving towards the north. If this thing stays sloppy and stays very weak, then it's not gonna do very much for us. It's definitely not going to do very much for us. Young Fresh, you think Central Florida is a Florida month for... Wait. Do you think Central Florida is a Florida month for hurricanes? I'm not too sure what you're asking there. Central Florida is a Florida month. Anyways... So on top of that, we also have another sacrificial feature that just worked its way up towards the north and the east pack that crashed into southern Baja California and the west coast of Mexico. And this is expected to funnel a bit greater relative humidity and moisture in the pattern to the north side of the system to hopefully get rid of this channel darkening to the north and help to alleviate a bit of that dry air to the north. And then on top of that, we also have a bit of diffluence associated with the jet digging down. I know I cleared the illustration, but we have our jet digging down over the central and eastern United States, coupled with our subtropical jet coming out of the East Pac and our anticyclone down towards the south. So we have a decent area of diffluent flow just out ahead of it. You know, the classic adage, divergence aloft ahead of a trough. So what we're seeing here is as this system lifts up towards the north, we're going to put ourselves in that diffluent quadrant. This is what could have either helped or hurt Ernesto, and it ended up hurting it because it came in at a favorable or an unfavorable angle. In this case, we'll have to wait and see how this thing manipulates the pattern and what our moisture out there in the East Pac does as it gets entrained within that anticyclonic feature, that high pressure in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere, and gets pulled in towards our system. Moving on over to our true color visible satellite shot. This is why I really like this image so much, because you can see everything that's going on to the naked eye. Let me go ahead and refresh this real quick so we can get a bit more of an extended view. I believe we should still have, or we should have a little bit more of the sun up. That works. And I will go ahead and pause it right there. So, actually, let me go back in time. I'll make it a little bit clearer for you all. So here we go, right there. We'll leave it right here because we're starting to get a bit of a dance between the two features here. So first and foremost, let me change the color of the ink. I'm going to use yellow here since this is a high contrast map. There is one low pressure system right there. Nice low vorticity that was attached to our stationary boundary, and you can see the impacts of our wind shear have utterly destroyed this feature. You can see here that all of our thunderstorm activity is rapidly getting sheared off towards the east and looks almost like a funnel right there. Everything's just being blasted towards the east, helping to up our rain chances along the New Orleans, the Louisiana Gulf coastline, Mississippi, Alabama, and some of that moisture is being ejected far enough to the east to play a role on our weather here in central Florida. Nothing crazy, obviously, but our daytime thunderstorms have been off the chain for a few of us. I almost didn't make it home the other night because of how ridiculous they were, driving out at about 11 o'clock at night, leaving the studio the other day. This is what's also going to help inject a little bit more oomph into our feature downstairs here. The convection is still displaced or away. It's co-located from where our actual spin is. The spin itself is somewhere in through this general area. It is over the south and central Bay of Campeche, and as you can see here, a lot of the thunderstorms that did fire up last night are now off towards the southwest, and I would anticipate as this continues to move inland and we lose that hot water source down below it, as well as the sun comes up and our instability gets a little more evenly spread out around the terrain, whether it be actual land or water, this whole cluster of thunderstorm activity here is probably going to wane itself off. It's going to look like a mere shadow of its former self. That does not mean this feature is weakening. We typically see these diurnal cycles, even with full-fledged Category 5 hurricanes out there that are self-sustaining. You'll see natural ebbing and flowing in the eye wall replacement cycles, so on and so forth. So as this continues to trudge down towards the south and this slowly lifts towards the north, you can kind of see what I'm already doing here. We have a system spilling in from the north and a system coming up from the south. So as a result, I'll change the ink here. What I think the models are also thinking is we're going to see a nice little consolidation between the areas that are coming together. Again, look at how I'm forming the streamlines here, that cyclonic curvature. We have flow from the north like so, flow from the south out of the East Pac like so, with all of our steering currents pushing our tropical energy that initially broke off from the monsoonal trough out there in the Atlantic over 7 days ago. This is what's going to help to kind of mash it all together like mashed potatoes and create a nice ball of rotation in the atmosphere. It's very similar on the small scale when you see supercells or multicellular thunderstorms interact with one another. Obviously, these are huge in comparison to the thunderstorms we'd see affecting your neighborhood, your local area. But if you guys have ever watched radar, when two supercells or two very heavily sheared thunderstorms come together, you typically see a bit of they come and then they whoop, and they more or less kind of fill in with one another. And that's kind of what we're hypothetically seeing on the large scale here, a very similar characteristic. Some could describe it as the Fujiwara. We don't have very concentrated areas of deep, low pressure, but either way, the same principles apply. We have an area of high height ridging aloft, diffluent flow and lower pressure vortices down at the surface. So naturally, that low pressure is going to want to go towards the closer or the more lower pressure area. It's just the natural characteristics of the atmosphere. High pressure flows to low pressure. So technically speaking, if that low that's coming in with our northern arrow there decides to feel the effects of that low pressure that's trying to organize to the south, it's going to want to get drawn into it, kind of like a whirlpool you'd see at the surface of a pool, of a lake, etc., like debris getting pulled into a whirlpool. Very similar concept, and sometimes that can help to spin it up a little bit faster. Just general physics we're talking about here. I'll go ahead and play the loop one more time. You can see this is a very tightly packed area of low pressure. That is a bona fide spin right there. And in fact, if it weren't for the shear and the weird lack of thunderstorm activity with it, it looks like we do get some thunderstorms to fire right over top of it at the very tail end of the loop there. This would probably still be characterized or identified as an area of interest brought to us by National Hurricane Center. This was previously classified. It was dropped because just how badly sheared this system is. Look at how it's elongated, and all of our thunderstorms are just getting ripped off towards the east in this general area. Our actual tropical feature is right there, so it's getting ready to wander underneath a lot of these thunderstorms. It's very hard to pick up, especially because I can't stand, it's a big pet peeve I have with some of these satellites, is when they do that random tick. I can't stand that because I don't want to draw on the animation and then have it look completely wrong because the satellite decided to boop and shift over real quick. But if you track it, starting the loop, you can see a very broad cyclonic spin, low pressure that drives off the Yucatan Peninsula and gets more or less gravitated towards all that robust thunderstorm activity. And that could possibly be what's also pulling this area down. So underneath, and I'll pause it again right there as it does that silly tick right there. We have one low here, and they're both being pulled in towards one another underneath the thunderstorm. So I would anticipate that if there's going to be organization and development, it's going to happen right in that general area. As the thunderstorms continue to fire and these two vortices dance around one another before being engulfed and put together into one mass area of lowering pressures. That's all we're looking at here, guys. If you want to break it down to as simple as possible to where even the most average viewer can listen, and that's not a strike at you guys, I promise. Just sometimes I get a little too into the weeds with the science aspect of it. We're basically looking at fluid motions, whirlpools. And obviously, if you guys have ever been to the pool, when you splash or do a cannonball into the pool, all that water gets displaced around you because you're introducing your body, your mass, to the pool of water. That's what creates the splash. And so what happens is, as that water tries to fill in, that's your area of low pressure. Obviously, we know that water naturally has a higher density than air above it. So as you splash into the pool, all that water that was displaced and splashed up on everybody around you now has to fill back in that area of low pressure that your body created by dropping in. And as we all know, higher pressure flows towards lower pressure. So as that water gets splashed up and displaced or pushed away from where you just cannonballed in, now as you get back up and move away, you're left with that gap of lower pressure, lower density in the water, so everything's going to flood back in. And that's kind of what's happening here. We have a large, broad area of lowering pressures, and both of these little vortices are getting pulled in together. And since we already have that cyclonic curvature in the atmosphere and that anticyclone aloft fueling the rising motions, creating the low pressure in the first place, everything's just going to come together in that optimal spot. And if we come over here to the winds, you can see, I know this is a little off-put. It's not a perfect area, but there's your cyclone in the low levels. This is going to be your lower level winds. Obviously, as the name implies, right there in the top left corner, you can see that broad cyclonic spin in these analyzed streamlines. These are your analyzed winds. And in the lowest levels between 950 and 800 millibars, you can see northerly winds here, southerly winds here. There's your broad area of lowering pressure. And if I scroll down just a little bit, can I have my cursor back? There we go. You see that we are right underneath the anticyclone aloft, that higher height system that's allowing for that chimney effect. Chimney effect basically means you take stuff in the low levels, and as a smokestack or a chimney would imply, when you light a fire, all that smoke has to rise up. Same principle here. Here's another look at the goes east, or no, not the goes east. Well, this is goes east, but this is a look at our zoomed-in Gulf of Mexico satellite shot. You can see all of our moisture down there brought to us by Weather Bell. This is our broad area of cyclonic curvature, and then our weak vortice that's getting pulled in from the north. Just wanted to give you guys another perspective showing that anticyclonic flow across the overall AOR with lowering pressure generally in that spot. So the individual vortices are not really what I'm paying attention to. What I'm looking at is the fact that we are right underneath an area of lower pressure and instability and rising motions, vertical velocities in the positive that will just naturally create thunderstorms. And since we just so happen to have a tropical feature down there, this should get it going. It should. Here's another quick glance at the East Pack. I'm just showing you guys as we play the satellite loop, you can see all that moisture right up in through here, getting entrenched within. There's your anticyclone right there. Spinning around, I'll add arrows to it so you guys get the general flow. We had this piece of moisture wandering up and now is going to be funneled back into our general Gulf of Mexico AOR. So just like with the Atlantic itself struggling to get put together because timing has just not been the greatest friend to the tropical Atlantic, we're actually looking at decent timing for this system if it has a fighting chance of putting itself together, or if it wants a fighting chance of putting itself together. That is going to give it an extra oomph, a little nudge in the right direction. Here's a look at the latest European model brought to us by 06Z, and I actually do agree with what the European model has in store for us here, a very sloppy, very mid-range tropical cyclone. And you can see at the very tail end of the run as we get into very early morning Thursday, that shear is beginning to take hold on it. There's your low pressure. Let me change the ink here. There's your low pressure, and you can see just in the forecast precipitation here, these different shades on the east side of it, your wind shear is buffeting it out of the west, so the European model is definitely thinking we're going to start to see that notching effect in the thunderstorms, making it a little bit more northeast and east side loaded, which unfortunately, I know a lot of you guys for some reason hate when I say that term. Unfortunately, that means a lot of our rainfall is going to particularly be displaced towards Louisiana. So regardless of how strong it gets, I mean, granted, the more intense it begins to develop and the more consolidation we see early on, the less of a detriment this wind shear will be. But regardless, there's probably going to be a lot more heavier rainfall and localized flood potential as we go through the next couple of days into Louisiana. Obviously, this still has a shot to move around to the left, move around to the right, and that'll pay dividends to whoever's in this general AOR from Alabama, Mississippi, through Louisiana and Texas. But as of where we stand right now, I actually do agree with the European model's depiction here. This could possibly be a little on the weaker side, just a little bit, but it also begins to pick up on that potential frontal activity that it will develop as it runs right into the polar front jet. You can see this little appendage hanging down here. This looks to be an embedded trough or a bit of that dry air getting pulled down off of Texas and developing a bit of a very, very weak cool sector with it, with what almost looks to be a little warm frontal sector right there. That's why from the jump start, I really don't think that this is going to be a strong system. I've been getting a lot of questions as to whether or not this could be a big hurricane, let alone a major hurricane, and I'm just not seeing it. JNSI, I really don't see it. We'll pull up the GFS real quick to take a look at what the GFS is thinking. GFS is fairly in line with the European model early on, takes it up just a little bit slower, and then we're suddenly off to the races of rapid intensification, deepening down into a full-fledged hurricane before making landfall. But you can see here that the GFS is clearly not picking up on as much of that upper-level wind shear brought on by the jet stream at 300 millibars, because notice how we have a bit more of a symmetrical storm as opposed to that east side loaded setup that we saw on the European model. So the Euro is still predicting that stationary front, that gradient, and that jet level wind shear highest up in the atmosphere is going to hurt this system's case, whereas the GFS, naturally being the GFS, even though it really hasn't done much this hurricane season, the GFS is still thinking we could see a bit of a stronger system. Is this potential on the table? Absolutely. Is this the most likely outcome right now? I personally don't think so. But again, real time, which is why I started off with a lot of our real-time data, satellite, the streamlines, the analysis, we're going to have to see how that anticyclone down here modifies the pattern. Because as this high height center continues to marinate over the Gulf of Mexico, what that does is it allows for different advections to occur. Advections meaning the movement of air. So if you think about this from a temperature perspective, I know we're looking at moisture here, but if you look at the wind flow, we have northerly flow to the north, we have westerly flow to our west, and then we have southerly flow, obviously, coming out of the East Pac, Mexico, around the west side of our anticyclone. So what that naturally does is it allows our warmer temps and our moisture to slowly try to push into southern Texas and the southern plains. What that does as well is it allows our front up here over the southeast and the mid-Atlantic to slowly wrap back around in this direction, whereas this area is naturally going to continue to see warming and modification through time because that is right underneath where our bubble of anticyclonic wind is. You're in that neutral point. And going a little bit further for you guys, let's see, where do I have it pulled up still? I thought I did. Oh yeah, down here as a matter of fact. You can see we are right beneath a call. These are your deep level winds, your deep level steering, and this is a perfect example of how we're going to continue to see general wind flow to our north and to our south, but we are right in what's called a call, a neutral point in the winds, which is also contributing likely to our thunderstorm development that we are still sustaining even as the sun comes up over the western Gulf of Mexico. So we are in that little notch, not nudge this time. This will help to give it a nudge, but we're in that perfect notch. And again, tropics is a huge game of chess. Tropics is a huge game of timing. And right now, we are perfectly cemented inside that favorable quadrant for organization of thunderstorms, which should help to deepen our low pressure that's already established there. The same thing can be said for Invest 92L. If you look out here, we have another very broad call. So we just managed to luckily find ourselves, lucky for the system's case, I should say, we've luckily placed ourselves, tropical-wise, into the most favorable aspects of the atmosphere. You can see here we have the TUT extending down on the western Atlantic through Bermuda into the Bahamas and Cuba, the Cayman Islands. So that's going to be an area of unfavorable environment. This area here is going to be a lot more favorable. This area here is going to be a lot more favorable because we are away from all of our more gracious amounts of wind shear, dry air, etc. Here's a look at our latest 6Z European ensembles, and now we're just going to start to blast through because we're just looking at potential solutions here. One random Euro member goes all the way down to Category 2 hurricane status, a very unlikely outcome to tell you the truth. This is just not a setup for a strong hurricane. It's really not. We saw it with Alberto. We saw it with Chris. We've seen it with previous systems and other hurricane seasons. Unless we were looking at less shear, if we did not have that gradient, that boundary to our north, that would be a lot more of a doable scenario. Let me go to WPC real quick so I can show you guys looking at the fronts. See that? We have a stationary boundary extended through the Gulf of Mexico down to our developing feature down there in the Bay of Campeche. And what that tells me is we have modified polar, modified continental temps to the north, and then we have a weak gradient of equatorial tropical temps down to the south. And remember, tropical cyclones are naturally circular in nature. They are barotropic. They are uniform. They do not like temperature gradients. If I take this uniform circle right here, let's imagine this is a warm system. Don't pay attention to the map. Don't pay attention to anything on the back side of this. I'm not drawing a circle around the low pressure in Colorado, so just get rid of that. Try to imagine this as a blank page. If I take a gradient, I'll go ahead and use blue. If I take a gradient and draw it through there, see what that does to our perfect circle? It starts to shred it apart. It starts to cut it up like a pizza, basically. You take your perfect pizza pie and you cut it up into slices, and we don't want that to happen with tropical cyclones, I should say. Do not want that to happen to its internal mechanisms because it creates all sorts of weird, just shock and awe to it. It kind of blows up all the natural processes that give it life. It's all internal to the system. Tropical cyclones don't really have too much outside influence to them that help them develop. It's all from the inside. From the outside, or from the inside out, what lies within, kind of like intrinsic motivation for us. I brought this up as well. This is your control member of the European model because not only will the anomalies show you what I was talking about in terms of just that general low pressure, you can see the blue shading here. This is all your lowering pressures. There's no uniform area of cyclonic spin just yet. We're not looking at a bona fide consolidated cyclone, but we do have those lowering pressures that do insinuate rising velocities, favorable characteristics, and instability. So that's what is likely going to help to give this system a nudge in the right direction. And then if you look, the most likely outcome brought to us by our control member of the Euro keeps it fairly weak, keeps it a little bit further towards the west as a mid-grade, maybe a low mid-grade tropical storm. Now, impacts before we get ready to wrap up. This is a look at our short-range ensemble forecast, the SHREF. We're looking at our 48-hour precipitation, so precip that could fall over a 2-day window. And if you look right now, because of that frontal system, I'll go to the tail end of the run. This is only 87 hours. This is about 3.5, almost 4 days out. You can see that the rainfall estimates are already starting to go up. Excuse me. So rainfall is going to be the predominant issue with this system as it tries to consolidate and potentially take on further tropical characteristics. We will start to investigate what storm surge will be like, wind impacts, if any, as well as the potential for power outages, urban flooding, roadway ponding, which was a huge detriment to my ride home. If you look over Florida, in a 2-day window, we're still seeing some pretty decent rainfall amounts, especially up near Daytona Beach, Palm Bay, St. Augustine, and Jacksonville, looking at possibly 3 inches of rainfall over a day or two span. And then right along that upper Gulf Coast periphery there, we're looking at anywhere on average between 1 inch to 3 inches of rainfall in a 2-day window. So remember that. I have the 2-day totals pulled up to show you just how much rainfall is associated with that potential cyclone out there in the Gulf, as well as that stationary boundary being fueled by the jet aloft and that natural gradient providing us with that additional thunderstorm coverage. If I switch over to our national blend of models, this is going to be our 12-hour precip. You can see in just the span of 12 hours, not even a full day, some of our rainfall totals are going to be very high on Thursday morning, Wednesday night into Thursday morning, as this feature, whatever it may be, moves up towards Texas and Louisiana. So in 12 hours, this would be warning criteria for us in United States Air Force weather. We're looking at anywhere between 1 to 3.5 inches of rain in 12 hours. That's a lot of rain. That'll very quickly add to any roadway flooding, any lake effect flooding, any river flooding, any overflowing of your bodies of water, whether it be a lake, a river, a stream, a creek, whatever, will allow it to puddle up. And the rainfall that we've had here, even down the local street here, Cypress Avenue. I know a lot of you aren't going to know, but just rock with me here. I'm just giving you a story. Cypress Parkway here that I usually commute to and from the gym and to and from the studio now. We've seen the thunderstorms day to day, and the other day, because of our sea breeze thunderstorms just piling up water, to put it into perspective for you guys, the road was already starting to see water flooding in on the westbound side of it. And I remember distinctly saying to myself, that's going to be bad if we get a tropical storm here. That's going to be very bad. This road's going to go underwater easily if daytime thunderstorms are already piling up the rainfall as we speak. So this is where I will cave, and for those of you who have already mentioned it in the chat, this is where I will say, regardless of development, because of the overall environment, a stationary boundary, as the name implies, it's not going anywhere, stationary. That's going to help to up our thunderstorm coverage. This feature, Tropical Storm Francine or not, is going to combine with all that rainfall already in place. So rainfall and flash flooding are going to be the number one risks here. To supplement that, or to caveat that, the reason I do emphasize we still want to watch intensity is because if this does take on a bit more of tropical characteristics, combined with that dry air to the north and the wind shear, I'm sure some of you know where I'm going with this, the tornado threat and the severe weather threat will go up as well. So that's kind of why, regardless of development, heavy rain, flash flooding, urban flooding, ponding, and all that is going to be a problem regardless. Intensity plays a role because then we want to investigate if there's any pockets of severe weather, severe convection, and tornadic activity, whether it be inland or water spouts right along the immediate coastline. Naz, do we need to set up the time-lapse camera at Lake Pontchartrain for this? Honestly, that might not be a bad idea, Mike, to tell you the truth. That might not be a bad idea, especially if this thing does continue to try to jog off to the east just a little bit. Which, in fact, I should have it in here somewhere. I thought I had pulled it up. Let me switch back over. We'll go to the 500 millibar heights here, brought to us by the European model, so I can show you steering real quick. As you can see, this is our area of broad low pressure. It's not very tight, not very consolidated, which is why I really don't think we're going to suddenly see this thing deepen and explode into Hurricane Francine. Just doesn't seem likely at this point in time. We'll have to continue to investigate. We do still have a couple days ahead of us, but as you go through the loop, notice the huge shades of red that pile up over Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, Cayman Islands, even the Yucatan Channel and the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. What that is high height ridging. These are areas in the upper atmosphere that are higher in heights. If you look at the top here, we're looking at our mean sea level pressure, which is down lowest to the ground, and then our 500 millibar heights, so we can see a combo of steering. And before I even push this chart forward, if we have a low here and a high height blocker here, this thing is going to go right up in like this, right up in this general area. It's not going to go anywhere else. So I don't really know where people are still getting Florida from. This is like the Florida Shield at this point. It's going to ride the western side of this upper high height center, this upper ridge, and move up towards the west-northwest and then the northwest, and then slowly spin around the clockwise spin of it up towards the eastern border of Texas or somewhere into central western Louisiana, depending on the orientation of the ridge as we go out through Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And yes, I do agree, my cursor's in the way. Chase the weather, I do agree. People unfortunately underestimate these smaller systems. Sometimes they are prolific rain and tornado producers. I fully agree and I fully concur with that, my friend. These systems, and again, goes back to what I said in the very beginning of the chat. We got to respect every system. We have to give it the respect that it deserves. I'm not going to say we got to be afraid of it or excited about it. We just got to give it respect. I think respect is a very happy medium. We have to understand the circumstances, respect the threats. James Spann, a chief meteorologist out there in Alabama, says respect the polygon. More or less the same kind of concept here. Respect the storm, respect the impacts, respect the intensity. That's pretty much all I got for you guys, though. As of right now, let's go ahead and take a quick glance at some of our models just looking out across the Atlantic Basin. I know that the 6Z GFS put us back into its Jover mode. It's not really holding on to any of our systems out there in the main development region. I'm not too sure why. You can kind of see that there is a bit of a hint that another wave is going to break over and bring down dry air. Perhaps that's why. The 0Z did in fact keep our system alive a lot longer and kept it self-sustaining out there in the Atlantic. Should be a full bona fide fish storm. I know obviously as we get into the very end of the La La Land portion of the GFS, it takes it up towards Atlantic Canada. I wouldn't sweat that at all. Definitely wouldn't sweat that at all. This thing's been all over the place. But if we switch over to the European model from 0Z or even 6Z, you can still see tropical development out there is anticipated. But we go back to 0Z, and the Euro is thinking we're going to miss our friends in the Antilles far to the north. You can see there. So as of right now, we're still just monitoring for our friends out there in the Antilles, the U.S., British Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. The imminent threat is obviously what's inside the Gulf of Mexico, and then we'll just continue to watch what happens out there in the greater Atlantic. If we do see a strong system begin to show itself, like this European model, remember, this is the Euro, and it's showing a Cat 3 hurricane out there, which is pretty impressive for the European model. What I'm thinking that we'll have to start to monitor as we go towards the back end of September is if we do get a strong enough cyclone to really break down the monsoon trough, perhaps then we'll see a return to our more traditional peak season configuration out there. So again, for those of you who may watch other channels who think that this hurricane season is embarrassing, a bust, yada, 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 stay away from that, please. And if you don't want to listen to this, then tune it out, turn me off, whatever you want to do. I'm not going to take offense to it, but I just want you to respect the circumstances, okay? Obviously, the H word is a figment of the past at this point. I mean, God forbid the hurricane season starts hard enough to where we can still verify that forecast. That would be scarier, if anything, than a lull. In fact, I would argue that if the hurricane season suddenly got cranking to where our H active forecast were to verify, that's more terrifying than if we were to have just an above-average season from start to finish. But that's neither here nor there. That's totally theorizing. We need to take into inventory what's already happened, okay? And I'll go back to the Hurricane Center homepage to show you this. We have had 5 named storms for sure. We could possibly have 6 over the next couple of days. All 6 of our named storms have affected somebody, and they've made impact, they've made landfall somewhere. We've had 3 down here alone. We had 4. We had 5, and then we had 6. All of our systems have played a role in harming property or personal life in one way, shape, or form. So we also need to respect the hurricane season and get rid of all that preseason sensationalism. That's why on this channel I have very, very heavily emphasized I don't care about named storms. I don't care about numbers. We can talk numbers at the end. We need to realize that we had 20 storms last year when I first started fully tracking the tropics with you guys. We had 20 named storms and 3. That's it. 3 actually really made a landfall. We've only had 5, and we're 5 for 5 in terms of the landfall department. And number 6, the most confident storm on the board, is looking to make another major landfall. So put that into perspective, because I do. I see a lot of channels out there, and I do see a lot of you guys as well going to these other channels, whether it be through self-promotion or just because, I don't know, maybe you want another secondary take, you don't trust me enough or as much anymore. I don't know. And again, I don't take any offense to it, but that's what happens when you go from source to source. You're going to get a totally different story. It's like sitting down at home on television and changing the channel, going through the different dramas, the soap operas, the news channels. You're going to get a different story every time. One channel may say, sloppy tropical storm, then you switch over to the next channel, Louisiana, be prepared for a hurricane. And it's like, who do you trust at this point? That's why a lot of your reputable meteorologists out there, James Spann, Matt Devitt, Paul Delgado, everyone out there across the spectrum, Jonathan Kagis, the team at WKMG, we all emphasize, find your trusted forecaster, find your trusted source and stick with them. It's tough when you start fishing for weather, as I call it. You're going to get a different story. You're never going to get an answer. It may seem like you're getting an answer, but I've seen it plenty of times where you guys will come back to this channel and you'll say, how come this person's saying this and you're saying that? Well, at that point, I can go on to a long-winded speech about why this, and this is going to happen, but it's up to you to make that determination of who you trust. I like this person because he hypes a little bit more. I like this person because he doesn't hype. I like this person. It's like, well, now you're forgetting the science behind meteorology. It's kind of like politics these days. We're very emotional in politics. We're not really looking at the stats, but that's a whole other thing. I'm not going to rip that Band-Aid off. With weather, you can't go emotionally. You can't be emotional in weather. That's just impossible. Weather is a science. Meteorology is a careful science, and a science that we still have a lot to learn. And that's why if you're in it for entertainment and in it for emotion, then you're not going to get the answer that you want. That's the thing. That's the whole thing in a nutshell. And I see so much weird information out there. I see folks making fun of this hurricane season, and I feel that's a disrespect to a lot of folks who have lost their lives. Again, last hurricane season, we had 20 named storms. A lot of folks would technically say that was a bust hurricane season because nothing really happened. We had a ton of fish storms. We had about 20, 30 fatalities and just a few hurricanes. We've already had more landfalls. I can go on and on, guys. The point is, we got to show the season its respect. Preseason forecasts, that's a whole other ball game. Not going to go into that department, but obviously impacts have been a lot more gratuitous this hurricane season, and that's statistically and realistically speaking. They just have. You can't make that up. You can't spin that. You can't sensationalize it, and we're potentially looking at another flood event down here in Texas, Louisiana, regardless of development. So it goes to show. Chase the Weather, we attend the same church as James Spann. That's awesome. He is a nice guy. Definitely very genuine, down to earth, tells it like it is. I like watching his content. And yes, before we fully wrap up, I'm going to start to close out. It is 9:57. We've almost been at it for an hour, and I'm just going to leave you with this. For long range, if the Atlantic decides to play along with what peak season typically looks like, I'm thinking the back end of this month and the first 2 weeks of October will be its prime time area to possibly exploit developing tropical cyclones. That's what I'm thinking. Obviously, I'm not manifesting storms. I'm not looking at anything particularly. I'm not going 800 hours into the future, but just looking long range at the different large-scale dynamics that are supposed to be shaping up. Supposed to be the key word here. I do believe that if the Atlantic wanted to take advantage of peak season, it'll likely be the second half of this month and into the first 2 weeks of October. Right now, this is not a typical peak season configuration. MDR stuff, yes, not so much in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a weird amalgamation of things. And Mike, thanks very much, buddy, for the $10 donation, for always answering my text, and for the time I'm about to take from you with potential. Yeah, no worries at all. It's what I'm here for. Now, Scott Patton, there's a reason they do preseason predictions, and if they're done right and they don't get into the hands of the wrong people, that's another thing. That's a story for another more casual live stream, but that's a thing too, guys. If you read the science put out by Penn State, MSU, CSU, NOAA, all the actual authorities in tropical meteorology, and hear me out, the actual authorities, I'm not even saying official sources, the authorities in tropical predictions, they summarize it and they put it together in a wonderful hypothesis that is digestible to us scientists, us meteorologists. What happens is it gets into the wrong hands. So if anything, Scott, what I would argue is the preseason forecasts, the preseason discussions need to be disseminated to the sources that know what they're doing, the actual official season forecasters. Forgive me if this sounds very rude or very harsh, but if you take a preseason forecast with all kinds of explosive, historic, extraordinary terminology in it, and you put it into the hands of a social media person or a person who's just barely getting into weather, loves to get excited, you're going to have that disgusting game of telephone, and we're going to be sitting here where we are now with so many people pissed because what happened to the H activity? What happened to the 3,000 named storms? And it's like, well, first of all, we didn't forecast that, and there's a lot more that goes into the forecast than just individual storms. Okay, there's way more, but I digress. Unfortunately, that's not going to stop. It would be an enormous recommendation of mine for NOAA, CSU, and our other authorities out there to stop openly putting this information out there, because it's going to give the proclaimed weenies, as I call them, ammunition to bring the views and bring the subscriptions to their channel. You know, it's good information until it gets into the wrong hands. That's the problem with it. You know, that's the big problem. It isn't the forecasts. It isn't the official sources. It isn't the authorities. It's just where that information ends up. And that's the problem. That's where the problem lies. You know, even last year, that's where the lovely insider, we should have had Tropical Storm Vince like 8 different times, because folks would get fixated on the data, the one model run. They would get excited about one person saying this and just blow it out of proportion, and next thing you know, nothing happens. It was the same thing with now our red blip right now. This system was supposed to be a hurricane to the south of Jamaica, and that didn't happen. And there were a lot of people who got really excited about it and then backpedaled it. I don't get it. I don't know. That's why I'm hoping that with working with the WKMG team, we can start to slowly decipher between the silliness and the weeniness and get the real information out there, because there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it. And Mike, I do agree. Yes, please. For those of you still with us, let's go ahead and nudge that like button if you would be so kind, so we can get this information out there. And we'll see you again tomorrow. Just weather. Jonathan Kagas and I will be doing another Tropics Talk, Tropics Update in the evening tomorrow together in the studio. So we'll be working on that. I hope to see you guys come in. It should be around 8 or 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We'll be working together again, just like we did on Friday. And I hope to see everybody there. We'll definitely be rocking the live stream again, 8 to 9 o'clock. We'll obviously keep you updated on social media, whether it be on my Instagram, here on the YouTube channel, and we'll talk to you about that some more tomorrow. Please consider clicking that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. If you happen to tune in this morning, thank you very much for all of my continuous followers, my faithful viewers, those of you out there far and wide who have been showing such genuine support to this channel. Again, couldn't be where I am right now without you guys. Thank you for confiding in me. Thank you very much for trusting me and giving me the confidence to continue to put these videos and all this content out there for you guys. It's been one heck of a ride, and we're only just getting started. This is a whole new chapter of the Weather Center, and for myself and you guys along with me. So hopefully you tune in tomorrow for Jonathan and I's live Tropics Update. Can't wait to see you all then. We have a lot to talk about and a lot to continue to talk about, and we'll see what happens. We'll definitely see what happens. Lestrio YT Gaming, this storm is going to go up the west coast of the Gulf of Mexico and impact our friends in Texas, Louisiana. Christina Estrada, you're very welcome, of course, and I appreciate you as well. I appreciate every single one of you. So that's that, guys. We'll see you again very soon. Drop a comment in the comment section down below. I'll make sure to get back to you at my earliest convenience, and we'll talk exactly about what's coming over the next 24 to 48 hours tomorrow. So we'll see you again very soon, guys. I hope you've had a great weekend and you have a wonderful conclusion to your Sunday as we go throughout the day, and we'll see you tomorrow. Guaranteed live from the studio over at News 6. Jonathan Kagas and I will be talking tropics together. Make sure to tune in. I'll notify you guys when it goes on the air, and you know the drill. This is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.